Good evening and welcome back to the Journey Home program. I'm your host, John Mark Grodi, and here on EWTN, we once again have this great privilege to sit back, have a cup of coffee, and hear a story of the good things the Lord has done in our lives. And we're joined tonight by Jack Williams. He's a former Evangelical Christian and the general manager of EWTN Radio. Jack, great to be with you tonight.
Yeah, John Mark, it's truly a joy and an honor to be here. You know, I told you a little bit before we started here that at the turn of the 21st century, when I was entering the church, this program with your dad was very instrumental in encouraging me as I went along. But, as I watched those shows many times, I would think to myself, these people are so intellectual and they've read every book that has ever been written in the history of time, it seemed like, with some of them. And I was often intimidated by, their scholastic prowess, and so I always thought that if anybody else has felt that way when they watched The Journey Home and were looking for someone who was a little mediocre scholastically, tonight is their night. So,
well, yeah, we're in the same camp, and I spent my life listening to the stories, listening to my father's story and the many people that he interviewed, and I'm in the same camp. I learned eventually that, again, what connects us all is that we're all people on a journey. We're pilgrims on a journey. And our stories may look different from others, but God has done good things in our lives, and He's calling us on to greater things. And so we have to be open to that and be looking for that story.
For sure. I mean, Holy Mother Church has something to say about everything, because you've got to meet people wherever they're at.
Amen.
And what speaks to me and what speaks to you may not be what speaks to the other person in the room. So it's important.
Very good. Well, it's great to have you here, Jack. I'll step out of the way, go back to the beginning. Where does your story begin?
Well, I was raised in a sort of a nominally religious, family. I mean, I knew we were Methodist. I was baptized in a United Methodist Church as an infant, and I knew that the family was Methodist, but we really, until I was in high school, we really didn't go to church as a family at all. We didn't. But a couple things that my parents did do. Number one, they had me baptized as an infant, which I told you. And I'm convinced as I look back, I've never doubted the existence of God. I have never felt like God was, some entity that it was impossible for me to have a relationship with. I've always, and I really believe that is due in large part to the indelible mark that was left on my spirit.
Yeah.
At baptism. And then the other thing my mom did is that she always sort of made sure that I was tied in with somebody, that I was going to church with someone. And during most of my youth in suburban St. Louis, it was with a family that went to the First Baptist Church in the town that we grew up in. And so I would go there, and, the youth group was outstanding. They had just amazing donuts between Sunday school and the main church service. We rode motorcycles. I remember Vacation Bible School, striving for that ribbon that you memorized 10 verses during the week of Vacation Bible School. And I still have a scrapbook somewhere in the attic that has all of those ribbons in it. So I was certainly aware as a youngster growing up of that. But as I said, in the house, that really wasn't a thing. Although my parents were certainly people of high moral character. Yeah. They both grew up on farms in Kansas, and they had that ethic that came along with that whole situation. My mom was, from the time I started kindergarten until the day I graduated from high school, with the exception of 1 week where they went to Spain because my father had won a contest. With the exception of that week, from kindergarten until the day I graduated from high school, my mom was home every day when I came home from school. And this is not to cast aspersions on any working mom at all, but it was a different time, and I benefited greatly from the fact that she was there. Now, there were times, of course, when she was a little more involved than I would have cared for her to be. I was not always particularly acquainted with the clock in my youth, and would not always kind of be home when I was supposed to be home, and she would come looking for me through the neighborhood, right? And every one of my friends in that neighborhood would see her coming but me. And they would be running behind bushes and going into the house and everything else. And the next thing I know, I'm by myself and I turn around and, there she was. It was like a Clint Eastwood movie, with the showdown. And my father had this, I've always wanted to write this book, America Was Better When, and just finish that sentence over. And I think America was better when parents were not afraid to discipline their children. And my dad had this hand-tooled leather belt. It was the kind that you put the big buckle on. I never saw it with a buckle on it ever. I saw it folded in half in my mom's hand. That's the only time I ever saw that belt. But I never, even as a young child, I was always very grateful that I was comfortable at home. I knew that I was loved at home. Yeah. That was something that I always cherished, even as a young kid, not even just looking back, but was, someone who had that safe haven that they could always go back to,
right.
Which was very valuable to me always. And as I said, I would go to this Baptist church, and because of that indelible mark that I think was there, I was very sensitive to the word. I was very sensitive to what people would say. I don't think that there is a mathematician that has ever lived that could probably calculate the number of altar calls I've answered, at least in my own heart, right? On television, how many times I've said the sinner's prayer, right? If I only knew about the sacraments and reconciliation at that point, it would have saved me a lot of time and heartache. But it was something that I always was sensitive to.
Yeah.
So after my freshman year in high school, we moved from the St. Louis area. My dad was in the tire business his whole career. And so we moved to the Lansing area in Michigan, where he was charged by some brothers to run a chain of auto parts stores that they had throughout the state of Michigan. So I went to my last 3 years of high school in the Lansing area, and I met a young man there, Greg Fishman, dear friend of mine. And so, Greg was a pretty soft-spoken guy, but he was a really popular guy. Nobody would have a bad word to say about, Greg. Mm-hmm. And he didn't openly speak about his faith, really, at all, to be honest. And but you knew there were certain things that the group, the herd would move in a certain direction occasionally, and Greg was not going to move with the herd in that direction, So you knew that there was something there. So after we graduated he was actually a year ahead of me in school. So he came home for the summer after his freshman year of college when I had just graduated. And so he invited me to come to a meeting that his family was involved with, because the Michigan State, the campus of Michigan State University is in the Lansing area. So he was part of this group in Ann Arbor at the University of Michigan that he was home for the summer, so he was part of the group at Michigan State when he was home for the summer. And this was a charismatic evangelical campus ministry outfit that had fellowships planted on college campuses around the world by that time, really. And so, I don't know how many of our viewers or listeners have seen what goes on at a charismatic evangelical campus ministry meeting, but it's some wild stuff, John Mark. Okay, there's singing, there's dancing, there's speaking in tongues, there's prophesying, there's all kinds of stuff, right? So, he knew this is not something we had ever discussed on any level at all, but he, his mom, his two sisters were all involved in this group. And for him to have the courage at that time, I mean, listen, that's not an age group that's really prone to putting themselves out there, right? And so for him to invite me had to have taken a certain amount of courage, and I ate it up when I got there. He couldn't have anticipated that would be my reaction, but I did. And I remember they had this particular group had sort of a stable of leaders that would travel around to the various, and kind of it's almost like a parish mission. They would kind of
Right.
do a week at a campus, right? And there was a gentleman named Joe Smith who had, we were very big. This group was very big into your words matter.
Mm-hmm.
You can speak things into existence just the way the Lord spoke creation into existence. So we were very careful. Some of the things we were very careful about were quite ridiculous as you look back on them, but we were very careful about what we said. And this Joe Smith was an older gentleman at this point, and he had these confession tapes, which is not confession as a Catholic would understand it, but he would read scripture, or he would state these biblical truths, and then you would repeat them after him. And so it was actually pretty helpful at the end of the day, but it got to the point where we would all be running around not just saying, the little maxims that he had recorded, but we would be saying them like him. And so it became a little bit comical to think. But I remember that first night when we were there, and I don't know how this could have been lost on me until I was a 19-year-old. But he essentially laid out the case that God wrote the Bible, and that just, you could have knocked me over with a feather. I mean, it just never dawned on me that this was the situation, and it was really an amazing epiphany. I remember going home and sharing this with my mom, who I know. My mother's mother is a very devout Assembly of God woman, and you knew it. I mean, her relationship with Jesus was her whole existence, right?
Right.
So I'm telling my mom, and my mom kind of assured me that she was fairly certain that there were humans involved in writing the Bible, and that she's not too sure about where I'm going with this whole God wrote the Bible thing. But I can remember sharing it with her, and I just remember it was such a joyful time, because this group was very close, as many of our evangelical brothers and sisters, very close to the fullness of the truth, but just not getting over those last couple of hurdles theologically.
Right.
They had they rebaptized, so we had this galvanized horse trough that we would do this total immersion baptism situation in, right? They had books, formation books that you would go through, right? Really their theology on baptism is quite beautiful. They talk about the circumcision made without hands, separating the old man it was really, really, I think a more substantial teaching than I experience in some parishes today, quite frankly. I was not baptized in the galvanized horse trough. The sort of assistant pastor of that fellowship, noticing that I really kind of had a hard time shutting up ever. He had this great idea that I would be baptized in the river that runs through the middle of campus at Michigan State. So we went out to the river, the whole band of us. He had a guitar. We sang a song beforehand, and we were right behind the administration building. And behind the administration building was a long, grassy hill that students would just lay out on during lunchtime and eat their lunch and read a book or study or do something else that led right down to the river. So it was customary whenever someone was baptized that they would ask, "What's going to happen to you? What explain to me so that that they understand that you understand right before they do this." And so Leo, wonderful man of God, asked me that question after we sang the song that we sang there. I am free. I am free. I am free to be a servant of the Lord. I remember it. And so he asked me that question, and I immediately turned away from the group and gave a little catechesis to everybody on the hillside about baptism and what was about to happen. So it was customary also for, words from the Lord to be given to people after the baptism for the person who had just been, for his edification, right? And I can remember, and we would record those things. I've long since misplaced that cassette, or I think I may have thrown the cassette away in a fit of anger at some point. But I remember Leo feeling like the Lord was telling him that, just as you have been baptized in the open, I will keep you in the open. And I had a real revelation at that point, a new understanding that I still struggle with, on humility. And humility is not necessarily just hiding in the shadows or not drawing attention to yourself. Humility is obeying what God's asking you to do.
Amen.
So being out in front of people doing stuff sometimes is an act of humility because you're being obedient to what God has asked you to do.
Right.
So this group was, I'm so abundantly grateful for my time there. They got me into the Word, which I had never really been before. And to be really quite frank, I'm not into it now to the degree that I was then and should be. So I've told the world now that I'm committing to getting more deeply into the Scriptures. I'm grateful for that, and I remember, while the theology may have fallen a little short, especially in the area of the Trinity,
sure,
it was still, these are people that loved God and that they were sincere. You couldn't really question the authenticity of anyone's motivations. And I remember, we almost lived in community. I mean, we would take over swaths of apartment complexes. And we lived in an apartment complex about the size of, I remember living in an apartment about the size of this desk with 3 other guys. We had 2 in one bedroom in bunk beds, 2 in the other bedroom in bunk beds. And one of our roommates had his wisdom teeth taken out.
Oh, dear.
So we brought him back, and he had all 4 of them done at once. He's just got a mouthful of gauze, and he's in his bunk. But I remember, Leo, who, as a Catholic, from a theological perspective, I can find all kinds of things wrong with now, right? But I remember him sitting on the edge of that bed and praying for him and laying his hands on him. And I just remember thinking, this is a guy that has a relationship with God.
Yeah.
He's talking to somebody that he knows. He's not talking to some, construct or some symbol or some, and that has left, obviously to this day, has left an impression on me. So,
right.
So I'm abundantly grateful for the time that I spent there. But as time went on, things got a little dicey, even by charismatic evangelical campus ministry standards. And, there were some people in the evangelical world that were, calling out, for lack of a better word, some of what was going on there. And really a lot of it revolved around the Trinity. This was a very heavily Jesus-based theology and a very heavily Jesus mandate, dominion mandate sort of a deal. Every individual fellowship was a church, and there were basically 2 kinds of Christians in the world. There were the Christians that were involved in our group, and then there were the Christians that should be involved in our group.
Yeah.
Those were the 2 kinds of things. So I was kind of on the front end of people who, sort of were not, and part of that was realizing that this is not really the truth. And quite frankly, part of it was just a rebellious part of me, that's there, that has a limit for how much I'm willing to be told, what to do.
Right.
This was not a cult. There were some parents that got a little freaked out at some of the decisions that their kids were making while they were in school and part of this group. But this was not. These were well-meaning people, many of whom have moved on to other sorts of places. But it was still, I was getting off the train at the first stop, pretty much.
Yeah.
And I had every intention of getting involved with someone else like that. But the longer we don't do something like that, the less likely it becomes that we're going to do something like that. And so circumstances were such that I found myself back home with my parents in the St. Louis area. I was working in downtown St. Louis at in the glory days of retail in the Reagan years, and in a department store in downtown St. Louis that had 11 floors of shopping, ladies. 11 floors of shopping in this. The building was an entire city block in downtown, and they were paying me far more money than they ought to have been paying me. There's a whole lot going on downtown, so I'm not necessarily out running afoul of the law or anything like that, but I'm drifting further and further away from God, and I'm basically, you wouldn't have been able to separate me from anybody else walking around the streets of downtown St. Louis. I did not stand out. I was not a beacon on a hill. I was just one of the blades of the grass on the hill.
Sure.
Going about looking for my own things. And then an interesting thing happened while I was working in that particular environment, and that was I met a Catholic girl.
Now, up to this point, I was going to ask you before we get to the break here too. Like, where was Catholicism even on your radar up to this point?
Well, it's interesting because the suburb, half of the St. Louis metro area is in Illinois on the other side of the Mississippi River.
Yeah.
And I grew up. People may have heard of the Hill in St. Louis. Yogi Berra, Joe Garagiola's from there. It's a big Italian neighborhood with just amazing food on every street corner. It's a glorious place. Yeah. Well, when the Hill sort of got full, the town I grew up in is where the Italians started to go. So it was kind of the Hill East. And so we would, the biggest institution in our town was St. Peter and Paul Catholic Church and St. Peter and Paul Catholic Grade School. And so, this is, St. Louis was, still is, I guess, but it was a Catholic town. I mean, it's named after St. Louis, for crying out loud. And it's, there were three, when I was a small child, there were three types of people in St. Louis. There were Catholics, Jews, and tourists. And so our family was kind of that real outlier of a Protestant, kind of a family. So I was around Catholics all the time. And it was not till later in my journey when I really started to take seriously the notion of entering the Catholic Church that I realized just how much I didn't know. And
they were part of those Christians that should be with us.
That's right. And this organization was militantly anti-Catholic.
Okay. Yeah.
Now, I think I was spared from that for some reason because I really didn't. I didn't think what they were saying was wrong, but I just didn't have the vitriol, and I think I might have been spared by that, by a particular grace that I'm grateful for. Yeah, for sure. Yeah.
So you met a Catholic girl, though.
So I did meet a Catholic girl who was not practicing her faith, and she was a convert. She converted when she was 16 for the holy and righteous reason of she wanted to go to Loyola University in New Orleans, where she wanted to go to school, and she wanted to be Catholic when she went there. So it wasn't exactly a deep spiritual conversion on her part, and she wasn't living her faith. I wasn't living my faith, but together we sort of kind of found our way together.
Sure.
Yeah.
Well, let's take a little break there, and we'll pick it up here in a couple minutes. So we'll be back in just a few minutes to hear the rest of Jack's story. I want to remind you, again, if you're on a journey, and of course we're all on a journey, but if you have questions about the Catholic Church, if you're perhaps wrestling with that question, check us out at chnetwork.org. We'd love to be praying with you and for you and helping you along that journey. We'll be back in just a few minutes to hear the rest of Jack's story. See you then. Welcome back to the Journey Home program. We're entering the second half of our hour tonight, speaking with Jack Williams. He's a former evangelical Christian, and he's the general manager of EWTN Radio. Jack, thanks for sharing your story with us so far. When we left off, after these experiences, by and large, very good experiences in your Catholic or in your campus ministry in that evangelical group. Now you're drifting away from your faith, and you've met this Catholic girl. So let's pick it up from there.
Yeah, so my late wife, Susie, and I worked together. We were both department managers in this cathedral of retail. And we started dating. One thing led to another. We got married. And so I didn't have anything else going on. So children obviously change your perspective on things. So we started going to St. Francis Xavier, which was the college church on the campus of St. Louis University. Beautiful, beautiful architecture, just a spectacular building, run by the Jesuits. Obviously, it's not part of the university technically, but it's part of the university, if you know what I mean. So, so we started going to mass there. I didn't have anything else going on, and so that was her tradition. So we started going to mass there. I don't know that I was terribly affected in a major way when we were doing that, but then we had an opportunity. We left the big retailer. My wife got a job with at the time, the world's largest specialty retailer that everybody would recognize if they walked through a mall. So she had an opportunity to cover a territory that went from Peoria, Illinois to the Mississippi River in Iowa. And so that was about a 4-hour trek from one end to the other. And so we lived in Des Moines, which was, and one of the reasons we took this opportunity is that I wanted to go to veterinary school. And there's only 26 of those in the country. So Iowa State has a veterinary program. So we, rather than having her drive the extra 45 minutes to Ames from Des Moines onto what she's already got to do, we settled in Des Moines, and then I drove the extra 45 minutes to Ames, and I went to undergrad for a year to establish residency, then applied, was accepted to the veterinary school. Right. And then as our son is becoming a toddler and a 2 and a 3-year-old, he's in a daycare facility that is 45 minutes from our home, that closes at 6 o'clock. And when all of your classmates are in the lab until 10 o'clock at night, it makes it a challenge to compete in that environment. So so the fact that I couldn't make a go of that was not really the mistake. That was somewhat unforeseen. Not having a backup plan, that was the mistake. So essentially, I got hooked up with this, as it turns out, a bit of a charlatan from Massachusetts who had come to Des Moines to start sports radio. So I got involved with him doing sports radio in that Des Moines radio market. And so that went along, covering high school sports. The people who owned the Iowa Cubs, which is the AAA affiliate of the Chicago Cubs, they didn't buy a radio station, but they leased all the time on a radio station so that he would have an outlet for the broadcasts of his team's games. Then he contracted with us to provide programming for the other portions of the day. So we did that for a couple years, and I met a family. And I'm getting a little bit ahead of myself here. During that time, we put our son in the parish school near our home. When we were in St. Louis, before we had moved, we lived in a historical neighborhood, the neighborhood where the brewery is located. We were all about urban renewal. We wanted our tax dollars to go to the city, and we were pretty idealistic about the whole thing. But a couple gunshots later, and our attitude changed a little bit. But we had always decided that the kids would go to Catholic school. And my primary righteous motivation for that was that I didn't want them going to a public school in St. Louis, right? So I'm not the virtuous guy that's looking to this. So I didn't have a problem with that. But as he's getting into second grade now, we've got preparation for First Communion. And so it really starts to occur to me that, while I've been going to Mass and been doing these things, I haven't really invested a lot of this in this myself. And I've kind of just I've been avoiding doing the discernment that I should have done the minute I left the other organization. And I knew that he was going to have questions. Why doesn't Dad go out to communion? Why, and these were things that I just didn't know that I was really ready to answer or wanted to talk about, and because I am a guy at the end of the day. And so I remember having a conversation with Monsignor Joe McDonnell of happy memory, who was the pastor of this parish at the time. And I always think that after speaking with me, he must have raced for his confessor for what he must have been thinking about my arrogant self after we had that meeting. But it led me to start to look a little bit, right? And Monsignor McDonnell had brought Christ Renews His Parish, that he had seen it in Florida, and he brought it to our parish, which for anyone who's not familiar, it's a Curcio-like deal, but it's contained within one parish.
Right.
And so we would have 2 retreats for women a year, one in the spring, one in the fall, 2 retreats for men in the spring and one in the fall, and they would be on consecutive weekends. And it would be an all-encompassing, you'd sleep on foam mats in the gym of the school, and you were there from Friday afternoon until midday Sunday. And so Susie went on a Christ Renews His Parish retreat, right? So she came back and she was all fired up, and she was, really happy about this whole situation. And part of that retreat is prior to the retreat, the core team that's putting the retreat on will solicit letters of encouragement that will be presented to the participants during the retreat. And they solicit those from just parishioners, from friends, from family. So we wrote a letter, whatever. So she came home and she said, thank you for the note. It was lovely. As you know, we got notes from like a bunch of people, and she's got this manila envelope that's full of these notes, right? And she says, it's really kind of a cool thing. If you want to read them, you're welcome to read them. And I'm like, that's your stuff. I'm not reading your stuff, right? Yeah. So, of course, the first time I was in the house alone, I read the stuff. And as I'm going through these notes, I see this simple little unprinted note card in an envelope. And it was from Monsignor McDonnell. And he basically said to her, and this is where I get emotional. And if I ever get to a point where I don't get emotional, I'll need to think something's wrong with me, right? But I read this note from Monsignor to Susie that basically said, at some point, I know that Jack and I have met a couple times, and he essentially told her that her witness was bearing fruit. And that was such a humiliating thing to read, for as pompous as I had been about this, because she would broach the subject on occasion, and I was hotshot evangelical charismatic campus ministry guy who had gone to Australia with only enough money to get there, and all kinds of stuff like this. So I could, and she didn't know the jot and tittle of her faith, and so I could pretty much shut those conversations down. I didn't have any interest in forwarding the conversation. I would just try to shut it down altogether to hide what was going on in my own heart to a large part. So that was a very humbling experience to read that. And that's what really led me to headlong into the RCIA program at that parish at that particular time. And God is so good to us. He gives us what we need when we need it. And Amen. He gave me the most humble sponsor that would just get out of the way and just let me be an idiot when I needed to be an idiot, and did not drop the hammer on me. And, I learned, so much, during that time. And we really had a very interesting situation, because as a much younger man, I had briefly been married before. So we had to go through the annulment process before I could enter the church and before we could have our marriage convalidated. Well, by the time Easter Vigil rolled around with this class, that process had not run its course yet.
Right.
So by this time I knew what the Eucharist was. I knew, and I was like chomping at the bit, but I wasn't able to finish this thing out at that point. But God did a really neat thing, because it wasn't until the following, late in November, that the decree of nullity actually came through. And so we had an opportunity. The RCIA class met on Tuesday nights. So we actually had an opportunity, because the class that followed my class had a couple of couples that were in that group that were kind of in that same situation. And so we had an opportunity on a Tuesday night. We chose to have our marriage convalidated at a mass before they had their RCIA meeting that the whole RCIA class could come to and see.
Beautiful.
Yeah, it was really, really something else. So we were really grateful for that the Lord took care of us in that way. So I entered the church in 2002 and still doing sports radio and, covering high school sports especially, which is, we could do a whole show on those stories. The places that I've done broadcasts from are not as nice as this. Let's just put it that way. But I met some people who owned the big Evangelical Protestant radio station in town. And this station is a blowtorch. It's heard in 90 of the 99 counties in the state of Iowa before sunset. And this was owned, interestingly enough, by a Catholic deacon. So this was a gentleman who was a spy in the Air Force during the Cold War, and could tell you some stories about that.
Right.
But as he was getting ready to retire, his brother, this is in the early 70s, was an FCC attorney, and in Des Moines, and he's from Des Moines, and he says, if I buy, I've got a beat on this country and western station that's really struggling, and I think I can get it for next to nothing. He said, if I buy it, will you come back here and run it? So he said, sure. So he did. And so there was no such thing as Catholic radio then, right? So he changed it to this Protestant format, and they were Catholic. And, so this was a really great gig for the family because the way Protestant talk radio is set up, all those programs pay for airtime on your station, and that's why they're on the station. Plus, it's in the commercial band, so they can sell advertising. They can trade for all of their daily needs with advertisers. So it was a really nice setup for the family. Well, he's listening to this stuff all day, every day, and he ends up leaving the church because of it. Well, down the road, his wife has a reversion back to her Catholic faith, right? The deacon, the not yet deacon, does not necessarily come with her right at that moment. So she arranges for him to have a meeting in the Des Moines airport, arranges a layover for Scott Hahn in the Des Moines airport. And this is back pre 9/11 when you could actually get something done in 45 minutes in an airport.
Yeah.
So she drags Deacon Chuck down there. He has this meeting with Scott Hahn, and 6 months later, he's in the diaconate program. So over the years, they had built this tremendous audience, this big Protestant audience that they felt a certain obligation to. So even though they were on this path, he was ordained a deacon, they went down, they were reluctant to do anything with the radio station. So I came on board, I couldn't tell you exactly what year it was, but I came on board and I started doing an hour of Catholic programming a night on this Protestant station. And in the background, I'm working behind the scenes because now a nonprofit has been formed. The deacon and his family have agreed to sell the station to the nonprofit, still be kind of involved in the station, and then we would make this a Catholic station carrying EWTN programming.
Wow. So
I'm working behind the scenes to put all this together, unbeknownst to the whole staff that I'm working with at this time. And we eventually did, flip the switch over 10 years ago now to bring this, probably been pretty close to 15 years ago now, to get this station. And to the deacon's wife's credit, the day we flipped the switch, you can only imagine what the reaction was. And she sat there. We flipped the switch at 7 a.m. Central Time, which is when the mass is, the live mass from EWTN. And she sat there from 7 a.m. until 10 o'clock that night, and she personally fielded every single phone call
wow.
that came in from their listeners.
Wow.
So it was, clearly a little rocky at first, but, it smoothed out over time. And 15 years later, they're still there.
Beautiful.
Yeah.
Well, bring us up to speed now, because a lot's happened since then in terms of your life and now with EWTN.
Yeah, so I remained with that group for a period of time. And then my late wife, Susie, her mom lived in Huntsville. Okay. So her mom's husband was a career Sikorsky helicopter man. Huh. And so he was a test pilot and an engineer. And then when he got to the point where his age was beyond what a test pilot and an engineer ought to be, he sold Black Hawk helicopters to the government. So his client was always McDonnell Douglas in St. Louis. So in the 88 restructuring and shuffling during the base closings, they sent him to Redstone Armory in Huntsville. And their plan was to just go there because he had 2 years till full retirement. So they were just going to go there for 2 years until he retired and then go back to St. Louis. Well, they liked it there. So when he was done, they just ended up staying there. So Susie at this time now was working for Apple Computer as kind of the ground floor of their retail division. So she opened the Apple store in Des Moines. Wow. She came to the Apple store here, or not here, but in Birmingham. Mm-hmm. And so that got us to Birmingham because a colleague of hers that she had worked with previously knew that her mom was in Huntsville and thought he could coerce her to, come to Birmingham and do that, which she did because, Birmingham is kind of ultimately where I wanted to get to because EWTN Radio had made a bit of a informal offer to me that if I would come down, they needed someone to work with their affiliates that were carrying their programming around the country because these were people that answered Mother Angelica's call, and they were not radio people.
Right.
Sadly, most of them were not business people. Some of them couldn't probably balance their checkbooks when they got involved in this thing, so we try to provide as much support as we can to this day for them. And so we came down. There was a little market correction that you might remember in history.
Right.
Excuse me. And so there was a hiring freeze. By the time I got there was a hiring freeze at the network. So I kind of became super volunteer with the kids and everything going on in school there. And then helped out with the local radio affiliate in Birmingham. And then I got a call one day from Tom Price, who was the director of programming and production at EWTN. Wanted to know if I would be interested in facilitating the open line program because at that time the hosts were kind of going solo on that show, and they kind of thought that it would be a little better if some of those hosts were not going solo on this show. So I kind of came on board to kind of steer that program, and then a couple years after doing that, they offered me the position of general manager of EWTN Radio, and that's how I got to where I'm at now.
That's amazing. And it's a wonderful thing. I really appreciate Catholic radio. So many of the people that we've interviewed over the years shared their stories. A turning point in the story was turning on the television or the radio, oftentimes even more so
it's a more intimate environment for sure.
For many people for whom their journey to the Catholic Church was, one that they were nervous about, that they were wrestling with, that people around them didn't understand. So many of them flipped the TV or the radio and heard Mother Angelica or heard somebody telling their story. And so it's a really powerful thing, and it's great to see how it's developed.
Well, Catholic radio really speaks to anybody, no matter where they're at.
Right.
If you are a completely unchurched person, you'll hear what you need to hear on EWTN radio. If you are one of our separated brothers and sisters, you'll hear the fullness of the truth on EWTN radio. If you're a fallen away Catholic, one of the beauties of the Catholic Church is that if you were raised Catholic, even if you were not invested at all, even if you didn't pay attention at all, if you didn't put anything into it, you don't know until the Lord reaches down to you just how much you took from that experience.
Right.
And I think you probably hear that from a lot of people, former Catholics, who will say, I had no idea how much I actually knew until I went somewhere else and started digging into things, and
right.
These things come back to me. And if you're a faithful Catholic, you'll be strengthened and nourished and fed by what you hear on EWTN radio. So it's really a beautiful situation of what we do there. And when Mother Angelica started the whole radio venture, she was actually contemplating pulling back from the TV operation that she had started in 1981 because mean, she was the abbess of a cloistered monastery, for crying out loud, right? So she was going to spend a little more time with her sisters. And she took that before her spouse in the Blessed Sacrament. And she said he not only told her that she wasn't to pull back, but that she was to start a shortwave radio network. She said, Lord, I don't know anything about shortwave radio. And he said, I know, get started. So being the dutiful daughter that she was, she got started. And she thought that this would happen in Rome, where all the languages of the world sort of coalesce. And so that's where she directed her efforts, and she just kept running into wall after wall after wall of European bureaucracy. And she thought, maybe this isn't where this is supposed to happen. So she started looking for real estate in the Birmingham area. And so many of your staff are familiar with this facility.
Yeah.
Look back fondly on it, but she was in a car with a real estate agent and her chief engineer at the time, Matt Scalisi. And they're going up this treacherous mountain road. For anyone who doesn't know, Birmingham is in the foothills of the Appalachians. Treacherous road, and which is every bit as treacherous today as it was that day. And she said that she saw St. Michael sitting on top of this mountain. Well, the whole way up this road, Matt Scalisi is trying to explain to her that you can't do on this mountain what you want to do. There's an intricate ground system involved in this operation. The ore in this mountain is going to throw all that off. What you want to do can't be done from here. So they get to the top, and she says, we'll take it. And Matt says, Mother, you're not listening to me. You can't do this at this location. And she asked Matt, she said, do you see St. Michael sitting on that mountain? He said, no, Mother, I don't. And she said, we'll take it. And so not only did it work at that location, but it worked beyond what an engineering study would tell you that it should. In fact, the first letter that they received after they flipped the switch was from Japan. And it was a woman thanking Mother Angelica for her channel of Buddhist prayer. And Mother said, Buddhist prayer? Huh. So she had one of the sisters do a little research, and the sister came back and said, Mother, they were listening to the rosary. They thought the rosary was Buddhist prayer. So in true Mother Angelica fashion, she said, let them think that.
God will work it out.
That's exactly right. That's exactly right. So that was kind of the humble beginnings of how all of that got started for EWTN radio. And, she before she flipped the switch to start that venture in 1992, she pulled the whole staff together. She couldn't do that today. There's too many of us. But then she would frequently pull them together for teachings and all sorts of things. She was sort of their mother as well as the mother to her sisters. And she told them what her motivation was for starting this venture. And she talked about Ephesians chapter 6. And most of us are familiar with Ephesians chapter 6, where St. Paul is encouraging us to put on the armor of God. But she focused on the battle described in Ephesians chapter 6 between the evil one and his angels and God and his angels. And she thought that if not even one person ever heard this radio signal, she was still sending the word into that battle that was taking place in the heavenlies. And she knew that that word would not return void, but it would accomplish that for which it was intended. And as we've come to learn over the years, as we say in Alabama, not one person, but a whole mess of people have heard that signal and have had their lives changed forever from listening to programs like The Journey Home.
Amen. Well, that's beautiful. And it resonates with what you said earlier about humility, that it's not about, sometimes we think of humility as hiding yourself away. And no, it's about obedience. And so that means stepping into what God's calling you to do, even if you can't see what the fruit's going to be. Right? Even if it seems like, well, maybe this will be futile, but it's showing obedience to God and letting Him bring the fruit, and it's always greater than we could imagine.
It is, and it's every. I often tell people when I share my story, if you look at my parents, who had a deep spiritual impact on my life by having me baptized, by planting me in church situations, my friend Greg, who took a big risk for someone of our age, but never would be confused for an evangelist. My late wife, Susie, who never gave up. As much of a jerk, and I was a jerk about this most of the time, she never stopped leaving the stray RCIA pamphlet in the bathroom, or the Scott Hahn tape is mysteriously in the car when I get in the car, queued up to a certain spot.
Right.
She never gave up. She would never be confused for Billy Graham, but she never gave up. And their obedience and their humility is what put me in a position, to have the faith life that I have now.
Amen.
And I'll be forever grateful. And then, my Susie got sick. She passed away. And as many of your viewers will know, I am now married to Johnette, of Women of Grace fame. And I kind of say that, all the groundwork was laid by the amateurs, and God felt like he needed to bring in a professional to get me over the finish line. So,
right. Well, and we just have a few minutes left here. We talk about your current work. I know, again, you continue to be involved with the great work at EWTN. You and Johnette also speak together and give marriage.
We do. We just gave a marriage retreat this past weekend in Florida, and that's important work that I think is going to grow and become even more important because, to be honest with you, I think if there is one area where our efforts should be placed, it's marriage.
Amen.
The evil one is no match for the Lord, but he is formidable, he's smart, he knows things, and he knows where to attack. He doesn't understand that he can't win, but he knows where to attack, and he's attacking marriage. Mm-hmm. And, woe to us if we don't go down swinging.
Yeah.
When you look in this culture, I like to tell people that I'm not going to let my democratic republic go down without a fight. And we should be even more resolved to that when it comes to things in the spiritual life, because we know we win in the end, right? But we still have to do our part,
right?
And I don't want to stand before him and have the list of what I didn't do be any longer than it needs to be.
Yeah. Well, we mentioned at the beginning too that again we try to remind people here that we're all on a journey, and
That's right.
Your journey may look different from somebody else's, but we're all on a journey. And if you've been called to marriage, you've been giving marching orders for a great mission in your life, and it's so easy to get into the married state and sort of just see that as the default. And now I'm trying to figure out what to do with my life. But that is a great mission. It's going to take the rest of your life and beyond to carry out that mission that you've been given.
Oh, that's exactly right. And what do we do? Listen, let's be honest. The church has not done us any favors in this regard. Mm-hmm. I mean, look at a priestly vocation. Mm-hmm. Really, there's 2 sacraments of service, holy orders and matrimony. Mm-hmm. I mean, what does a priest go through? At least 8 years of formation. Yeah. They're required to make a canonical retreat every year. Mm-hmm. And what do we do for married couples? A weekend, and here you go.
Right. So that work of encouragement, again, teaching people about their faith and the nature of their marriage, but just the encouragement. And that's something I thought along the way in your journey, the need for people along that way who in gratitude and humility can encourage each other. There's the content of the faith. Certainly we want to teach the faith, help people get the right belief, the right doctrine, get that right. But the state of a person's heart, the work of encouraging people on that journey to persevere as they're working out their marriage and their vocation and all that, it's a great work of mercy.
That's the big thing. There's hope.
Yeah.
We're never without hope.
Right. Yeah. All right, Jack. Well, it's great to have you again here. Again, so people can go to EWTN.com/radio to find out about...
They can find everything. They can listen to all of our feeds. They can find out more than they care to know about any of us that are doing these programs. All the archives are there. They can listen to the Journey Home live there. If they're in their, if they've got their smartphone and they're in their car and they can't watch TV at 8 o'clock Eastern time on a Monday night, they can listen to it on the radio. We carry it all there. Anything you want to know about EWTN Radio, EWTN.com/radio.
Awesome. Well, thank you so much, Jack, for coming to share your story. And this is a good reminder tonight, to have, a member of the team at EWTN here to be praying for them. Again, I always try to remind, you and I, as we do this show.
If for no other reason, pray for them if they have to deal with me.
There we go. We're all people on a journey, right. And that goes true for our, for each other, but also for our priests, for our catechists, our teachers. It goes for those people, those good people at EWTN who are making this this show possible, making this station possible, making all the radio possible that's heard around the world. Again, I love that story that you were able to share with us, Jack, about Mother Angelica endeavoring to send the word out there into that battle. So we'll keep each other in prayer. Again, thank you for being here for this episode of the Journey Home program. I pray that Jack's story was an inspiration to you. We'll be back again next week with another story, but in the meantime, remember that you and I are on a journey. Jesus loves you. Just be praying what that next step is He's calling you to take today, and let's persevere in prayer. So see you again next week. God bless.